Welcome to a special episode of Gaslit Nation. I am your host, Andrea Chalupa, a writer, filmmaker, and the screenwriter and producer of the upcoming journalistic thriller, Mr. Jones. Today, we're going to focus on that faraway battleground state, Ukraine. Why should the average American voter care about Ukraine? Because the average American voter likely didn't think about Ukraine much back in 2016. And if they had, they would have known Paul Manafort was a Kremlin-linked operative experienced in the dark arts that aided Putin's attack on Ukraine's democracy and our own. As we always say on Gaslit Nation, from election hacking to information warfare, Ukraine is a laboratory for Russian aggression. Ukraine is an important framework for us in the West to understand the challenges of the 21st century and how best to confront them. That includes kleptocracy, resisting autocracy, asymmetrical warfare, and so forth. If Ukraine can resist the Kremlin's aggression and confront corruption, then, so can we. It's in our best interest to care about what happens there, which is why the EU and US have historically been united in their support of a strong, stable, and democratic Ukraine. Things have been playing out differently under Trump, with the president's own lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, encouraging corruption in Ukraine in order to dig up dirt, any conspiracy theory that might stick against the Democrats. Now that Manafort is in prison, Giuliani seems to have taken his place, especially in trying to drum up Democratic scandals to distract from Trump's many investigations, just like Manafort did. Giuliani has been desperately searching for a way to frame Trump's opponents, like Clinton and Biden, and punish whistleblowers, like my sister, a former DNC consultant, and Ukrainian reformer Sergei Leshchenko, who both tried to warn the public during the 2016 election about Trump's Kremlin ties. Like Manafort, Giuliani has his own long history of furthering the Kremlin's interests. Ironically, just as Manafort worked unpaid to run Trump's campaign, Giuliani too worked unpaid as Trump's lawyer in the Russia probe. Apparently, both men had other reliable sources of financing. Giuliani has been entrenched in blood money for years, including being hosted in Armenia by a Putin ally, speaking alongside a sanctioned Russian official there for a conference in fall 2018 to strengthen the ties of the Eurasian Economic Union. What is the Eurasian Economic Union? It's the Kremlin's answer to taking on the European Union. It's an economic union of post-Soviet states that largely have atrocious human rights records, like Belarus and Kazakhstan. They've tried for years to get Ukraine to join, and Ukraine is like, no thanks, they're trying to join the EU. Giuliani's presence at this conference served the Kremlin's interests, as does his years of working for pro-Kremlin Ukrainian officials with ties to organized crime. Last September, Democratic senators, including Elizabeth Warren, wrote a letter to the Department of Justice inquiring whether Giuliani had filed as a foreign agent. Here's what their letter said. Giuliani's work on behalf of the city of Kharkiv, Ukraine, whose mayor is a member of the Party of Regions, is also concerning. The Ukrainian Party of Regions' connections to the Russian government and anti-democratic activity are well documented. Paul Manafort and Rick Gates, who both served in senior roles on the president's 2016 campaign team, were convicted of or pleaded guilty to criminal acts in part because of their work on behalf of this Russian-backed Ukrainian political party. Mr. Giuliani's financial connections to the organization's close ties with the Russian government, and Mr. Giuliani's ongoing public advocacy against Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation of Russian interference in the 2016 election raises further questions that warrant review. Now, Giuliani may have even played a role in obstructing justice in the Mueller investigation. During the investigation, Giuliani told CNN he was in contact with Manafort's attorneys, getting briefed on Manafort's meetings with Mueller. As the Mueller report lays out, Manafort had assured Gates that he had spoken to Trump's personal counsel and they were going to, quote, take care of us. The word pardon was never used, but it didn't have to be. The question remains, if Manafort had flipped, how many more indictments could there have been? What else would have been revealed? We may never know because the influence of the president's own counsel, which includes Giuliani, apparently made a difference. Oddly, soon after Trump took office, he named Giuliani a top advisor on cybersecurity. Everyone laughed at the time and made fun of Giuliani for being as relevant to the issue as an AOL CD. Months later, Trump announced a cybersecurity plan with Putin. It was quickly killed following inevitable backlash. As multiple reports have revealed, the Kremlin's cyber war continues on our country and threatens our election in 2020. What is so-called cybersecurity expert Giuliani doing about this when he's paid by the same interests furthering these attacks? There's an even darker thread to Giuliani's blood money. He's also consulted for Bahrain, yet another regime with an abysmal human rights record, Brazil, Turkey, and a shady opposition group from Iran known as the MEK, which has killed Americans, Iranians, served as a private militia for Saddam Hussein, and was labeled a foreign terrorist organization by the State Department. Giuliani himself helped to successfully lobby to get the group's terrorist label removed, and he has repeatedly called for the overthrow of Iran's government. Now that very same shady Iranian opposition group is being used in John Bolton's obsessive campaign to go to war with Iran, despite U.S. intelligence, just as during the case of Cheney, Bush, and Iraq, insisting there's no legal basis. If Trump and Bolton get their Iran war, this will be Bush's invasion of Iraq all over again. Hundreds of thousands of civilians will be killed. Allies of the White House will profit. America's standing in the world will plummet. And in the chaos and destruction, terrorist groups will be born, just like ISIS was born from Bush's Iraq invasion. One has to wonder whether Trump possibly pardoning a Navy SEAL platoon leader, Edward Gallagher, who killed Iraqi civilians, as well as a Blackwater contractor who did the same, among other accused war criminals, is to normalize the type of mercenary he needs for his war with Iran. So when you see Giuliani entertaining cable news pundits on TV or on Twitter, sounding like a shameless conspiracy theorist glued to a recliner in front of Fox News, keep in mind that this is a man with the influence and clear determination to unleash incalculable destruction on the world in exchange for power and profit. Now we turn back to Ukraine. The country recently elected Volodymyr Zelensky, a popular comic who won the hearts of Ukrainians by playing a school teacher whose viral video ranting against corruption leads him to becoming president. It's called Servant of the People. That's also the name of his political party. Zelensky is a blank slate. During the election, he was vague about his positions and his advisors. Well, now that he's been sworn in as president, we're getting a clearer picture. And so far, it's not promising. Zelensky has appointed as his chief of staff a former top official from the government of Yanukovych, the Putin puppet overthrown in Ukraine's Euromaidan revolution. Other Yanukovych ex-officials and allies have returned to Ukraine, having been driven into exile by the revolution. Clearly, they feel it's safe now. Popular anti-corruption reformers are also included in the government, but they may just be window dressing. Only time will tell. During the election, Zelensky battled allegations that he was a puppet candidate, a revenge candidate, for a powerful oligarch, Ihor Kolomoisky, who was busted for massive bank fraud by the outgoing president and driven abroad. That has been confirmed. Zelensky's new chief of staff is also Kolomoisky's lawyer. While Kolomoisky has done much good for the country, including financing a private army in the early days of Russia's invasion, when Ukraine's own military had been depleted under Yanukovych, Kolomoisky is ruthless and famous for having had an actual Shark Tank in his office. Look it up. Right now, as with any administration, there's always a power struggle. The dust still has to settle, but talks of Zelensky's government potentially holding a referendum, like the Brexit referendum, to let the people vote on how best to address Russia's invasion are troubling, especially in a country saturated with oligarch-owned television networks that push their own propaganda. While Ukraine's outgoing government has cleared up Giuliani's accusations, namely against Joe Biden, which we'll go into on this show, corruption runs deep. Giuliani may get lucky yet. On today's show, we're speaking with a longtime Ukraine watcher, the Russian-American journalist and editor of the literary magazine The Odessa Review, Vlad Davidson, who met last month with Zelensky for about an hour on the campaign trail. Vlad, a longtime friend of mine, shares his impressions of the new president and whether he'll be up for the job. Our interview took place in early May 2019 in the Ukrainian East Village restaurant in New York City, where the great filmmaker Sidney Lumet, director of 12 Angry Men, used to hold rehearsals. Vlad himself is a character out of cinema, a young man who dresses in tweed suits as though he's been set designed by Wes Anderson. And he keeps these gorgeous steampunk-like journals filled with collages, sketches, all sorts of impressions. His intricate journals have been displayed in a gallery exhibit in Odessa. During our interview, Vlad sketched in his journal, and I just wanted to paint all of that for you, of this scene of this often entertaining and always enlightening expert on the modern Ukraine, as well as on why we here in the West should care about what happens there. So here I am with Vlad Davidson, the founder and editor of the Odessa Review, man about town, man about the world.
True, thank you.
A journalist. And disclaimer, Vlad and I are friends. We have been for many years, but the reason why I brought him onto the podcast was because he recently had a 1-hour meeting with the newly elected president of Ukraine,
Mr. Volodymyr Zelensky. Thank you for having me on, Andrea. The noble Andrea. So great.
It's Andrea. Why did you Americanize my name just now?
I don't know. It's not something I typically do, but I just did, I guess.
When in America. Vlad, you split your time between Odessa, Ukraine, and Paris?
Yeah, I'm based in Paris 2 weeks a month, and I spend a week a month in Ukraine and a week a month in New York, which is not bad, but it is tiring sometimes.
Okay, let's cut to the chase here. So in the U.S. right now, we're all Ukraine experts. We're forced to be because Ukraine is factoring in a very big way in our national politics here. It's, for one thing, a petri dish of Kremlin aggression. And another, we have the Trump White House and also Trump's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, is essentially trying to, as we've seen in recent reports, trying to get dirt on Trump's opponents out of Ukraine. That's normally not how the U.S. government works. Usually the U.S. government fights corruption, but here in this case, we have the U.S. government trying to make a deal out of corruption. So I want to hear from you all your thoughts on what we can expect out of Ukraine with the changing of the guard, a new president that very much seems like a empty vessel, a blank canvas, that a lot of voters, nearly 75% of voters voted him in, which is an overwhelming condemnation of the outgoing administration and a big vote of faith in him, even though he was, as has been reported, was pretty vague on his advisors and his positions and so forth. And so I think Americans, I've been getting a lot of questions, which is why I asked you to come on the show, is where is everything going in Ukraine, and just sort of giving us a lay of the land there, what we should expect, what we should look for, and then we can sort of go into issues from there.
Okay, so let's unpack all that piece by piece. First of all, Ukraine absolutely is the battleground in the middle of everything. The liberal democratic, undemocratic split, east-west, the future and the past. It is the battleground where lots of other processes are taking place. It is the place where I think the European Union and the Western Alliance make their stand. It's an extremely important country. It is a post-Soviet republic, which is chaotic and democratic, but has many, many, many problems, and is making an attempt to break from the past and reinvent itself. It will be a light onto the rest of a post-Soviet world, as Mr. Zelensky himself said upon winning the presidency now 2 weeks ago. It is a remarkably important country, and people are only understanding that now. Now, with Mr. Giuliani, it's very interesting. I think the entire American political class, to a great extent, has debased themselves. We'll go off into the details, but just to start with Mr. Giuliani, this is a gentleman who's accusing Mr. Biden, whose son unwisely took a job on a board board of directors in Ukraine a couple of years ago, and thus opened his father up and himself up to accusations of political chicanery. But Mr. Giuliani himself has spent the last 5 years running around Ukraine making money. America's mayor in Kharkiv meeting with the mobster mayor of Kharkiv. Mr. Giuliani has, I try not to be partisan. I live outside of the United States, and I see what both parties have done in terms of make money in Ukraine, which is plentiful there. But Mr. Giuliani is the last person who should be talking about corruption in Ukraine, because he's been running around Kiev and Kharkiv for the last 4 or 5 years making money hand over fist.
Are you using social media sites to stay in touch with friends and family, only to discover that these sites are monitored by autocratic governments and spies? Well, Gaslit Nation fans, we have an alternative and safe way of documenting your life and staying in touch with the people you love. And it makes an amazing gift for Father's Day, too. It's called Storyworth. Here's how it works. First, you purchase a subscription for someone you love, and each week, Storyworth sends them an email with a question about their life. Then they simply reply to this email with their story. All stories are private and only shared with the people that you choose. Finally, after a while, their stories will be bound into a beautiful keepsake book. This is a great way to stay in touch with your loved ones and preserve your memories for generations to come. Data on Storyworth is secure and everything is private by default. You control who sees your stories. Take that, Cambridge Analytica. Storyworth is a great way to record your family history without nosy data mining companies getting in your business. Visit storyworth.com/gaslit for $20 off when you subscribe. That's storyworth.com/gaslit.
And to be clear, from that New York Times piece that came out by Ken Vogel, who also was the author of the Politico piece claiming my sister colluded with Ukraine in 2016, so there's a bit of a pattern that's clearly emerged with Vogel's own reporting and being an easy mark in journalism, where you can place hit pieces on your opponents, clearly, as we've seen. But in terms of the prosecutor, Shokin, that Biden was pressuring to have fired, Shokin was one of the worst prosecutors that was in that government.
That's absolutely true. First of all, anyone who works in Ukraine and follows Ukrainian politics, as I and my colleagues do, knew that Shokin was really, really, really bad news. Mr. Shokin was a corrupt member of the old guard, and he was installed by President Poroshenko, who will now be leaving office in about a month or 3 weeks, no later than June the 2nd. He was installed to keep control over political and politically sensitive cases. Mr. Shokin was bad news, and whenever the American or the Dutch or the British or the French or the NATO ambassador or the UN ambassador or whoever, or the IMF resident representative, whichever responsible adult was coming into Mr. Poroshenko's office to have a conversation with him off the record about things that needed to be done, the first thing that they would always go through, the top of their list, was the need to sack Mr. Shokin. For like a year and a half, this is all responsible elites from Europe, America, Canada, NATO, the European Union demanded of the president of Ukraine. So Mr. Shokin was really bad news, and that interpretation of the facts is, to me, a Ukraine hand, frankly ridiculous.
Yeah, without question. And there was zero indication from anywhere that Biden had anything to do with any potential investigation into the company that his son served on the board for. So independent of all that, this was a prosecutor general, which is the same position in the U.S. as attorney general. He was somebody who was caught up in his own corruption schemes. Could you go into that a little bit?
That's been widely reported on in both the Ukrainian press and within specialist press, like the Atlantic Council blog, Foreign Policy. If you go back and look at the kinds of things that he was accused of doing, Mr. Shokin was more accused of being a kind of a roof for political cases, which Mr. Poroshenko didn't want touched. I mean, the corruption was more that his job was to guard the old elite from being prosecuted. That's what Mr. Shokin was doing. Mr. Biden, his son, that was not good wisdom to have taken a job like that on a board while his father was vice president. He was put on that board because of who his father was, not because of his own business experience. All sorts of political analysts and political operatives and journalists that I know who have talked about that case have said, yeah, of course this is a silly article and a silly accusation from Mr. Giuliani, but Mr. Biden's son made a bad decision in terms of his own father's political career taking that job, which he should not have done. And if I had a son in that situation, I think my son would know not to do that.
Without question, but at the same time, Biden was one of the best allies for Ukraine, as we all know, in the Obama administration. And it was too bad that his son got involved there, and we all thought that was weird at the time. With Poroshenko, though, specifically the outgoing president, who took a beating. He
was brutalized.
They spanked him out of town.
It was. I was an election monitor. These elections, I was an international election monitor. In the election precincts that I observed in southern Ukraine, I observed 14 or 15 election precincts. In some precincts that I observed, President-elect Zelensky was getting 10 votes for every vote that the sitting president was getting. He was outvoted 3-1. This is the biggest margin in the history of Eastern European politics since the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think any East Bloc, Warsaw Pact country, Romania, Poland, Moldova, Ukraine, this is the biggest beating that anyone has gotten in a presidential election in the last 28 years. This is a utter and total and categoric humiliation for a sitting president who twice negotiated peace accords with the Russians.
So tell me, how do you explain such a beating?
It's a great question. I mean, it's been 5 years since the Maidan. Expectations were really high. They were unmet. They probably could never have been met. Much of the reform agenda, and there's been tremendous reform. The Ukrainians did more than 25 years in 4 years than they had in the previous 25. Much of that reform was very technical, very difficult to explain to Ukrainians. That said, the president certainly continued making money, and he continued shielding old elites. He certainly did not do as much as he could have. He could have really done a lot more. A lot of people thought the economy is growing at 3%, but when between 2014 and 15 the economy collapses because of the war and the hryvnia loses 70% of its value, a lot of people are living very, very difficult lives, and they know that it'll be another generation before they catch up with Poland or where they were if they continue growing at 3-4% a year. The war has ground on. 13,000 Ukrainians are dead. There's just a lot, including the complete monopoly on the airwaves by President Poroshenko's political opponents, who for years and years were saying that he's a very bad guy, that he is not doing enough. The propaganda or the television coverage from the television stations owned by his political opponents, it really hits mark after a couple of years of attrition.
So he wasn't actually that bad. All those sort of factors combined, the high expectations following a revolution where dozens of people gave their lives to live in a stable democracy free of widespread corruption, as well as Putin's ongoing invasion, which certainly was not his fault, and then the propaganda apparatus of all these oligarch-owned TV networks. So you think that all those factors combined, he just caught a bad break?
I think he could have done a lot more than he did, especially with communications. He didn't communicate well what he did well, which was foreign diplomacy, which was stewarding international relations, which was getting two very big things, the free visa deal with Europe and the creation after 300 or 400 years of an independent Ukrainian church outside of Moscow. Those things, which is to say international relations, he stewarded very well. And there were real successes. But I think it just wasn't enough. The election campaign was based on his slogan was something like army, language, religion, and so those three things, which were real accomplishments, the language policy, the cultural policy, the creation of a really serious Ukrainian army and a capacity to defend the state, and the creation of an independent Ukrainian church. I think ultimately people said those things are great, but what I care about is corruption. What I care about is my pocketbook. What I care about is my living standards, which are really down. What I care about is the fact that none of the corrupt political elite has been replaced, that this man has served his role as kind of a bridge between the old Ukraine and the new Ukraine, and it's time for him to go.
And it certainly doesn't help optics when you go through something like 4 prosecutor generals in 5 years.
Yeah, it really doesn't help. He really wasn't willing to give up control on that. He really wanted to keep control of which cases go up and go down, which cases are open, which closed. He was not willing to open an independent court for anti-corruption. He wanted some kind of chamber, an alternative to a court. He didn't do that till after the first round of the presidential election, when he was trounced before the second round. It was too little too late. He was not willing to do certain things that he should have done 3 or 4 years before, until 2 weeks before the second round, when he knew he was going to lose, and he needed to do as many things as quickly as possible.
So Ukraine's revolution that overthrew Yanukovych, who was arguably the most corrupt president Ukraine has had, it very much had a mandate of fighting corruption. And out of that emerges this oligarch president, Poroshenko. And you would think, even though he was an oligarch, he was on the ground there in Maidan being a leaderless movement that brought together people from all walks of life in Ukrainian society and even all over the world. And so it's sort of strange that after all the violence that he saw up close, that he wouldn't be transformed by that on any level and do what his mandate ordered, which was fight corruption from the very beginning of his term. It's like, why did he wait so long?
Well, he did. It's not fair totally to say that he didn't do anything to fight corruption. From sector to sector, it really varies. On procurement, especially, the Ukrainians did a fantastic job of cleaning up procurement, which was 10% of GDP leaking away a year. I mean, or was it 10% of the GDP or 10% of the budget? I forget, but one or the other. Basically, 10% of a budget was leaking away every year for procurement abuse. They set up a market for procurement, which is totally automated, totally on the internet. That got rid of certain kinds of corruption. Other kinds of corruption were minimized. Certain kinds of things like VAT corruption, tax corruption, they set up international best practices to get rid of that stuff. On other things like the army, procurement, which was never really reformed, medical reform didn't go through, pension reform didn't really go through. It really depends which sector you're looking at. Banking reform they did. Education reform they did. They did a lot, but they didn't do quite enough. They certainly didn't communicate enough what they did, and he wasn't willing to give up power. Certainly, Ukraine is much better now than it was 5 years ago in terms of corruption. And really, you have to prepare people for a generation-long fight to build a new country. And I think people were expecting in one presidential term things would really change overnight and it would be Disneyland. But that's not the way things worked in a country like that.
But there's also an antagonistic relationship that he had with reformers in the country and activists and simply being called out and people feeling isolated from the reform process itself.
Yeah, he was just very thin-skinned, a bit autocratic, very arrogant.
Bearing the lead here, Vlad.
Yeah, he was not very good on the campaign trail. He's autocratic in terms of his style, democratic in terms of the policy, but in the way that he campaigned, he was not very charismatic, he was not very open. He's an old guard man. He's definitely Homo Sovieticus. He's about 52, 53 years old now. He comes from a Red director's family. He did not adapt very well to the new democratic way of doing things, and he was not great on the campaign trail. So he was outmaneuvered by a young, energetic, very open, very socially media-savvy young man by the name of Mr. Volodymyr Zelensky.
And so you touched on something which is still a big problem in Ukraine, which I think everyone should be aware of now that we're talking a lot in the U.S. about authoritarianism and how it works. And it's this Soviet mindset. Razum for Ukraine, this nonprofit group in New York, asked me to moderate a panel with Ukrainian journalists just to talk about the Soviet mindset and confront it, because they feel like it really stands in the way of people sort of growing Ukraine into a modern, stable democracy. And Poroshenko, from everything I've been reading over the years, he suffered from that Soviet mindset. It's that top-down command, autocratic command, and not allowing the democratization of ideas and talent to rise to the surface, and just sort of like letting go of controls of all sorts.
Yeah, I mean, there's this concept that political scientists and Sovietologists and Soviet people and Russia studies people, Ukraine studies people use is called Homo Sovieticus, Soviet man. So I don't think that Poroshenko is the worst example of this, but he certainly is a byproduct of his time, and he was already an adult man when the Soviet Union collapsed, and he was already formed, and he was formed even more in the wild 90s. He's been in politics, I think, since 1997, 1998. He was already 30, I think, by the time he was in the Ukrainian parliament, 29, 30. And he's already set in his ways, and he wasn't able to adapt to new ways of doing things.
So now you have this young, modern, Western-facing president, which was able to leverage the power of social media to communicate to everyone in a very fresh and different way. And what's really interesting about him, which I don't think was utilized enough on the campaign, from what I read, certainly not in the Western press, is his wife is really impressive. She's a screenwriter who collaborated very closely with her husband in building their famous show, where he plays the president of Ukraine. And the first season's available on Netflix. And it's called, what, The Servant of the People?
Yeah.
So the future First Lady of Ukraine, Mrs. Zelenska, she did an interview with Anna Nemtsova in the Daily Beast where she came out sounding like a lot of the hipster kids, at Hromadska TV, an independent media network, and who were, backing Maidan, and sounds very modern. Can we believe that when they talk about human rights and the importance of protecting a free press and the multiculturalism in Ukraine and sort of that whole spirit that is very much this new face of Ukraine that the outgoing administration shut out?
Yeah, first of all, shout out to Anna, who's a great journalist and a friend, and she's lovely and hardest working woman in Russian-American media. She's great. The new First Lady is a woman who wears cool dresses with sneakers. She is modern. They have a modern sensibility. They have a modern marriage, obviously. Is Zelensky really a modern man? I think he's half and half. He's very interesting in this case that he's from the Ukrainian south. He's from the southeast. You have to really understand his background. He is 12 years younger than Mr. Poroshenko. He's 41 years old. He is born to a Jewish intelligentsia family in Kryvyi Rih in southeast Ukraine, which is a very, very, very gritty industrial town. He is from a Russian-speaking family. His culture is much more Russian than it is Ukrainian, and he made a lot of crude ethnic jokes and gay jokes of a kind that wouldn't pass muster in New York in the year 2019 or anywhere in America in the year 2019. The humor is very 80s, early 90s kind of vaudeville, Borscht Belt kind of rough humor. I don't think it's badly intentioned, but it's not the kind of thing that would pass muster here, right? So he is from a Jewish intelligentsia family. He's very post-Soviet, like early 90s, as opposed to the 80s and late 70s when Poroshenko grew up. His culture is modern Ukrainian in a different way than some of these other reformers, is that he's not really a ethno-nationalist. He doesn't speak Ukrainian all that well. He's learning it now. He spoke to me in English more than Ukrainian. I spoke to him in English and Russian, mostly in English and a bit of Russian, and he doesn't like to speak Ukrainian for very long. He drops back into Russian. He's very, very Russian culture oriented. His election represents the victory of the cohabitation of two visions of Ukrainian culture as opposed to Ukrainization. So that's very obvious. The 2014 to 2019 process of Ukrainization, as it was being shepherded along by half the country, is over. That's what this represents. For better or for worse, right? That process has been halted. Maybe it'll start again. Maybe things will go differently after the next president comes to power from another part of the country. But he really represents a kind of Russian-speaking, Ukrainian patriot intelligentsia that is cool with speaking Ukrainian a little bit and will send their kids to Ukrainian-speaking schools and is okay with their grandkids being totally Ukrainian-speaking and is a patriot of a country and has done business and lived in Moscow. But he's not the same guy, certainly, as Poroshenko with his Vinnytsia power base or people from Western Ukraine. It's a different thing. So is he modern? Yes. Is he modern in the same kind of way that we think of modern here? Maybe not so much. It's very interesting. He's a hybrid case.
Okay, so what does that mean for the country?
He has a buy-in from the Russian-speaking part of a population which was certainly doesn't want to live in Russia, certainly doesn't want war, certainly doesn't want to be dominated or occupied by Russian business or Russian political elites, but is uncomfortable with change taking place very quickly. In the first round, he won 19 out of 24 regions, with 2 regions going to the ultra-Russian candidate, Lugansk and Donetsk, obviously, and 2 regions going to President Poroshenko in the far west, and 1 region going to Ms. Tymoshenko, former Prime Minister Tymoshenko. He won 19 out of 24 regions in the first round, and he won 23 out of 24 regions in the second round, with only Lviv going to sitting President Poroshenko by a very small margin of 57 to 43, right? 57% only for sitting president. Some regions, including my own Odessa, 85% for President-elect Zelensky. Next to the war zone, Donetsk, Lugansk, almost 90%, 9 voters out of 10 went for Zelensky. This is a rebuttal to the sitting president. You could read it in different ways, but you could also read it as a refrain, a riposte against Ukrainization as it was taking place.
What does that mean, Ukraine? Because there's also a lot of patriotism that came out of the revolution itself, where I heard a lot more Ukrainian in the streets of Kiev. You had kids painting bridges and fences and things in the colors of the Ukrainian flag. So why would there be a backlash against that?
It's a very interesting thing. Anyone who says that Ukrainian was being put upon regions south and east, that's not true. The effect of the Maidan was to change the Ukrainian nationalism of the flag and the blue colors and the Ukrainian language from being an ethno-nationalism to being a civic nationalism. Anyone who ran around with the Ukrainian flag before 2014 was an ethno-nationalist as opposed to a civic nationalist. So the Maidan Revolution of Dignity was very good in that it made Ukrainian and the Ukrainian language and Ukrainian aesthetics and the Ukrainian semiotics and symbols and history and culture into something that Greeks and Bulgarians and Russian speakers from Odessa and people on the Belarusian border could accept as a national identity outside of its traditional ethnic components. I'm certainly not against this, and I'm talking about this as an outside observer, right? That said, the process of Ukrainization, which was changing the language that people outside of Ukrainian-speaking regions were teaching their kids in, which was making minimum percent of Ukrainian language that had to be heard on television, on radio, which is actually, by the way, totally normative because the French do it. Lots of other people do it. There's no problem with that. The Ukrainians passed a law saying that 40% of television content and radio content had to be in the Ukrainian language. That is okay. Ukrainian is the one government language that is normative for a liberal democracy in Europe. However, some parts of Ukraine in the southeast and in the east were not comfortable at the pace of change. So whether President Poroshenko was voted out of office because of the language politics or because of the poverty or because of the corruption or because of the fact that he was a bad communicator or because Ukrainians historically don't give presidents a second chance. Out of 6 presidents of Ukraine, only one has ever been reelected to a second term. No one else has ever been reelected other than President Kuchma. You could look at the results in many different ways, but certainly his view of the way that Ukraine will deal with competing visions of the culture for the future is going to be more like Belgium than like France, which is to say 2 nations cohabiting easily, uneasily, with arrangements, with understandings. But certainly the 2014 to 19 period of the Ukrainian language and Ukrainization spreading in educational and institutional and cultural positions, that is not going to be rolled back probably, but that's coming to a halt. And I make no normative judgments about this as an outsider, right? I certainly don't believe that the country should have 2 languages. Ukrainian should be the language of policy and administration and of the legal system and of the educational system. Obviously, there's a lot of minorities in Ukraine who need to be allowed to educate their children also in the local level. That's a question of federalization. But certainly I'm not against Ukrainization. But certain people in the Southeast are.
Right. And just to provide some context for our audience wondering why we keep going on and on about language, why that's such a hot button issue for Ukraine, well, it's a number of things. Number one, the history there of Eastern Ukraine. It was before Stalin came in with a deliberate policy of colonization, which included banning the Ukrainian language, forcing everyone to speak Russian, and
Importation of Russian speakers from other parts of the Soviet Union. Yeah, it's incredibly important and interesting history. People in the West who say that the language issue is a huge issue are typically either don't know what they're talking about or they're spouting Kremlin talking points.
That's exactly right. I was in Civic Hall, a wonderful, forward-thinking, progressive organization that focuses on tech freedom and a lot of important democracy issues. And a very bright young woman from a very democratic, pro-Western, progressive organization was talking to me about Ukraine. And she's not Ukrainian. And she was saying, oh, how are the Russian speakers in Kiev? Are they safe?
Yes, they are safe. I speak Russian in Kiev all the time, and no one's ever been anything but very, very, very polite to me. I've never in my entire life asked anyone to speak Russian to me without them offering. I'm not a native speaker of Ukrainian. My Ukrainian's okay now. I'm from the Russian American diaspora, and my wife is Ukrainian. We speak Russian and French to each other, but no one's ever said to me, "Don't speak Russian in any part of Ukraine." And I've never asked anyone not to speak Ukrainian to me. And I've always made an effort to demonstrate respect for the language, and everyone does. It's a country where no one demands that anyone speak the language that they're not comfortable in. Language politics is not very important. It is something that was mobilized historically by politicians once every 5 years before elections. For the most part, not to say entirely, but for the most part, it's not important whatsoever.
The reason why we're getting the weeds on this is because Russian propaganda has exploited this to the point where they've tricked Westerners into thinking that there's some oppressive thing going on against Russian speakers inside Ukraine when it's simply not. And that's why we're kind of beating this dead horse quite a bit. Yeah. But I do want to say also, my grandfather is from Eastern Ukraine, from Donbass, which is now Russian speaking. But when he was born and grew up there, it was Ukrainian speaking. And then Stalin came in and just shut down Ukrainian national identity, imprisoned the intelligentsia, killed the intelligentsia, shut down all their organizations and churches and so forth, whatever was left of any sort of churches at that point, and forced everyone to speak Russian. So it is very painful. It is a symbol of Kremlin imperialism and genocide also, because all those conditions of attacking Ukrainian national identity were followed by Stalin's genocide famine in Ukraine, which deliberately mass murdered millions. 90% of the victims were Ukrainian there. So with that, it is a very loaded issue for Ukrainians, but they, as Vlad said, people just carry on with their day and speak whatever they want. And I've ran errands with a friend in Kiev who's from Donbass, and he spoke Russian when he was picking up his prescription pills, and the woman behind the counter in Kiev spoke Ukrainian, and they got along fine, and nobody batted an eye.
It happens every day. People speaking to each other, and one speaks Ukrainian, the other speaks Russian. And also, a lot of people speak a Slavic patois called surzik, which is just a very odd and illiterate rural mix of Ukrainian and Russian. Lots of people just mix up Russian and Ukrainian in the same sentence. They conjugate words incorrectly. They make up Russian-Ukrainian conjugations on the go.
And the big cherry on the sundae of this topic is that Putin invaded Ukraine, claiming that he needed to protect Russian speakers
and Russian-speaking minorities. That's a good transition back to Ukraine's new Jewish Russian-speaking Ukrainian nationalist president-elect.
So what is Putin going to do now? That the other favorite line that Kremlin propaganda likes to use, not only in their whole propaganda machine domestically, but also in the social media bots. They like to drive this fake narrative that Ukraine is a fascist, far-right state, and there was all these neo-Nazis, and the Euromaidan revolution was neo-Nazi. And even though there is a far-right problem, of course, in Ukraine, like there is in every single country in Europe, like there is in the US, like there is in Canada, it gets blown out of proportion because the Kremlin makes sure it gets blown out of proportion and really tries to label anything Ukrainian with a neo-Nazi far-right framing. And so the big joke is, okay, well, what's the Kremlin going to do now that the president is Jewish?
And the prime minister is Jewish also, by the way. By the way, Ukraine is now the only country other than Israel whose prime minister, both head of state and head of government, are Jewish gentlemen who were both born in the same exact week in 1978 in the first month, I think it was the second month of 1978, one in Vinnytsia, the other one in Dnipro. Yeah, it's totally bizarre, yeah. It shows how accepting Ukrainians are, that they didn't care whatsoever that Mr. Zelensky is halakhically Jewish and of Jewish descent and is of Jewish identity, although I do think he baptized his kids in the Orthodox faith. But, it doesn't matter. He's as Jewish as the day is long when you look at him and you talk to him. And the entire Ukrainian electorate knew this, and they voted against Mr. Poroshenko anyway.
They didn't really care, that's the thing.
No, and he was open about it in the election interviews. He didn't hide it. He never played it up nor played it down. He said, yeah, I'm Jewish. I also speak Russian and I'm a Ukrainian. Who cares? The entire population who was watching television and saw those interviews knew and didn't care.
You're Jewish yourself, and you focus on a lot of those issues in your writing, and you write for Tablet and a lot of other Jewish interest outlets. So you've been covering Jewish issues in Ukraine for a very long time, and you have a very long lens on the very rich history between Ukrainians and Jews going back, many, many centuries. Sure. And could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, so obviously with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukrainian Jewry is becoming more Ukrainian, and obviously most of them spoke Russian at home, but now the Ukrainian Jewish population is more Ukrainian-speaking. Jews live a normal life in Ukraine. In Kiev, in Dnipro, in Kharkiv, in Odessa, there are large Jewish communities of Ukrainians who are of Jewish descent and go to synagogue. They've transitioned from being Soviet Socialist Republic of Ukraine citizens of Jewish descent to being Ukrainian Jews. It's a very important and interesting process. Again, both the president and the prime minister of Ukraine now are of Jewish patrimony, and it just shows that the country is safe. And, relationship between Ukraine and Israel is very strong and it's very important. And in fact, the last thing that President Poroshenko did in foreign policy that no one really noticed, even after the Tomos, the
independence of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church from Moscow.
The last thing that President Poroshenko did symbolically in January, February of this year was signed a long-expected and long-negotiated Israeli-Ukrainian trade accord, which had been under negotiation for 7 years, and he fast-tracked that so he could have that done before the elections.
In your writing, I think it was your article for Tablet, you wrote that Poroshenko, the outgoing president, created a golden age for Jews in Ukraine.
Yeah, well, what I said was a golden age of Jewish-Ukrainian relations in Ukraine on the state level, on the intergovernmental level, on the level of Jewish elites' relationship to the government in terms of the government listening to their interests and inviting them to speak at things. Is as good as it's ever been. I mean, President Poroshenko was a philo-Semite. He put a lot of effort into the Jewish relationship, and the 75th anniversary of Babin Yar in 2016, he really put a lot of effort into making that into a world-class thing. And he should be remembered, even though he's going to be a one-term president, as a president who's done a lot for that very important relationship for a minority that has lived in Ukraine for hundreds and hundreds of years and has done so much to build the country.
Do you think Zelensky will continue that?
Well, Zelensky is himself a member of the Jewish minority, so obviously there's not going to be any government anti-Semitism under a Jewish president, clearly, nor would we expect that. The relationship between Ukraine and Israel is extremely interesting and complicated because
it's not just about Israel as well, right?
No, it's not just about Israel. It's about relationships to the Jewish diaspora and relationships between Ukrainian Jews and the Ukrainian government.
But you're right that Israel does play an important role for Ukraine for a number of reasons, including a lot of Ukrainian soldiers get sent abroad to Israel for all types of medical treatment.
Yeah, Israelis have been very helpful with that, and lots of Ukrainian Jews who have service in the Israeli Defense Force came back to Ukraine to fight in the East, including friends of mine. I know tons of guys from Kiev and Odessa who were young guys and went off to study in Israel or live in a kibbutz and then serve in the army and find themselves, who in their late 20s or early 30s came back to do business to Ukraine. A lot of these guys picked up rifles and went off to fight with their IDF training against separatists and Russian invaders, right? There are tons of cases like that. I know a lot of them. A lot of IDF guys, Ukrainian Jewish guys, helped on the Maidan, trained the Maidan revolutionaries. So that's a healthy relationship. What you have to understand is that Russia is now, with the American withdrawal from the Middle East, Russia is now very much a Middle East power in the way that it has not been since the 1970s. So Ukraine, Israel, and Russia are in a triangular position, which most people do not understand, which is incredibly rich, incredibly complex, and incredibly interesting. So the Israelis have a very complex relationship. They have hundreds of thousands of citizens from both countries, Russia and Ukraine. And a lot of these people, Ukrainian Jews and Russian Jews and Israeli Jews, they're literally relatives. So it's the first time since the First World War where European Jews are on two sides of a war. This has not happened in 100 years, with the very quirky exception of Finland fighting on the side of the Axis and not purging its army of Jewish officers. There were like 500 Jews during World War II fighting in black SS uniforms in Finland, but nobody knows that, and it's a quirky historical fact that no one knows about this. But to really see European Jews on two sides of a war, of a conflict, this has not happened in 100 years. And this is an extremely interesting thing to me.
Israel sort of caught in the middle of Ukraine and Russia.
Absolutely. Israel has Russian officers fighting shoulder to shoulder with Al-Quds guys, with Iranian expeditionary forces on the Golan Heights, on the border. Netanyahu has literally flown several, I think 4 times by now, to Moscow to negotiate a buffer zone with the Russians. How closely will Iranian troops get to the Israeli border? That is, to a large extent, decided in Moscow.
Right, and Russia being a close ally of Iran.
A very close ally indeed, yes. Certainly in Syria it is. Again, some of the same troops who fought Ukrainians in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine were several months or a year later fighting alongside Iranian guys and Shiite forces, expeditionary forces, against Syrian Sunnis on behalf of the Syrian government. So it's all incredibly interwoven. This is the new Middle East, and it's intimately connected to what's going on in Ukraine between the Russians and Ukrainians.
To deal with these abnormal times that we find ourselves in, we here at Gaslit Nation take a strong stance of saying no to savior syndrome. The only thing that's going to get us out of this is self-reliance and holding our leaders accountable. And the only power we have left that we can rely on is grassroots power. To illustrate our point, here's Share, providing a useful metaphor for these times. Rely on no one but your own hard work and dedication. That's the only way out of this. Awaken your inner Share.
You said a man is not a necessity, a man is a luxury.
Like dessert. Yeah. A man is absolutely not a necessity.
Did you mean that to sound mean and bitter?
Oh, not at all. I adore dessert. I love men. I think men are the coolest. But you don't really need them to live. My mom said to me, you know, sweetheart, one day you should settle down and marry a rich man. And I said, Mom, I am a rich man.
Welcome to the Gaslit Nation Action Guide, available on our website, gaslitnationpod.com. Democracy is a lifestyle. Trump is a symptom of the corruption, institutional failure, and indifference that we can no longer tolerate.
Okay, so number 1, get a guide. Stride Toward Freedom, the Montgomery Story by Martin Luther King Jr. is an essential guide to self-management, managing others, and building teams. This inspirational case study of resistance, written by a young MLK after successfully leading the Montgomery bus boycott, shows how smart organization took on the authoritarianism of the Jim Crow South. Never forget that MLK was considered a radical in his day, even though there's nothing radical about demanding human rights and dignity. Today, the same remains true. It's not radical or socialist to demand that corporations stop polluting for profits and to call for an end to tax breaks, like for sending jobs overseas, that worsen the income inequality crisis. To help communicate these urgent issues, another essential guide is the all-new Don't Think of an Elephant, Know Your Values, and Frame the Debate by George Lakoff.
Number 2 of the Gaslit Nation Action Guide, focus on state races. States decide key quality of life issues, and local candidates help drive votes up ballot for federal races. Every District and Future Now are 2 excellent groups working to build a progressive infrastructure and turn states blue from the bottom up. Get involved by donating what you can, or join or start your own group with their help in your state. We provide on our Action Guide interviews with every district and Future Now. For more background.
Number 3, join. Grassroots power is one of the strongest forms of power we have left in America, especially with Mitch McConnell and Trump packing the courts. Don't succumb to savior syndrome by expecting Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or whomever else you admire to do all the work. Representatives are human and need our help. Fulfill the far-right's worst nightmare by creating generations of AOCs by helping build a more progressive union. Join a local group from any of these great national organizations for important action alerts like demonstrations or getting out the vote. Indivisible, Swing Left, Sister District, Move On, Flippable.
Number 4, fight global warming. Sunrise Movement is a grassroots organization demanding a Green New Deal. There are a lot of other groups working to adopt urgently needed green initiatives. C40 Cities connects cities around the world committed to taking climate action. 350.org helps activists rise to the challenge of the climate crisis. And there are more trusted organizations that need our support, linked to on our Action Guide.
Number 5, unionize. In the age of Trump, there should be no more fear of starting or joining a union. Just tell your boss that you saw how unions protected workers during the universally unpopular Trump shutdown. Fight for 15 and its local variants are working to ensure a fair wage and strengthen unions in the service sector. Don't know how to get started? Read Organizing to Win, new research on union strategies, and No Shortcuts, Organizing for Power in the New Gilded Age, both of which are linked to on the Gaslit Nation website.
Number 6, run for something. There are a lot of great groups out there that demystify the process of becoming a candidate and running a campaign. Run for Something is one of our favorites. There's even a book to help you get started. Run for Something, a real talk guide to fixing the system yourself by Amanda Littman. If you believe in facts and science and are a compassionate human being, you need to run for something and recruit others to as well. Even if it's a long shot, you can still create urgent conversations and treat your campaign like a platform for discussions you care about, helping bring together like-minded people to work for change even long past the election. Just look at what a refreshing discovery Longshot Mayor Pete has been and all the great work Andrew Gillum continues to do to register 1 million voters in Florida.
Number 7, protect the vote. Every District Action Fund just launched a, quote, report card identifying states with enough progressive support in local governments to push through important voting reforms like automatic registration and the abolishment of racist voter ID laws. Is your state on the list? You can click a link and find out. If so, every District Action Fund empowers you to help your state reach the gold standard of voting. Concerned about vote hacking and Ivanka Trump branded voting machines? Yes, that is a thing. Secure Our Vote provides background information and other resources to take action. Other groups to check out are Spread the Vote, Let America Vote, and Project ID, which help people get the information they need to register, vote, and get an ID. And again, these are linked to on our site.
Number 8. Launch ballot initiatives and laws. Why not launch a ballot initiative? Kate Fahey turned her Facebook post into the movement Voters Not Politicians to end gerrymandering in Michigan. It passed overwhelmingly. We have a link on our action guide for you to read more of her story. Or you could build a grassroots coalition to get a law passed in your state. In our episode, How to Pass a Law, I interview my mother about how she, while pregnant with me and a young mother already, without any political experience, mobilized a grassroots army to pass the child car seat law in California. Yes, it can be done.
Number 9, end terrorism in America. Moms Demand works to elect candidates and lobby for sensible legislation to stop the gun violence epidemic driven by the blood money gun lobby, the NRA. Southern Poverty Law Center exposes white supremacy, a leading terrorist movement in America. To help immigrant communities deliberately terrorized by Trump's cruel border policies, we have a list linked here of groups that you can support.
Number 10, make art. To say that art cannot make a difference stems from a tone-deaf attitude of privilege. Ukraine's Euromaidan revolution of 2013 and 2014 relied on art and artists of all kinds to sustain protesters living in Arctic cold temperatures and under the threat of government-sanctioned violence. North Korean dissident Yeonmi Park said that Orwell's Animal Farm helped her heal after escaping the cult-like dictatorship. And in our episode, The Blue Wave Continues, Kansas Rising, we share Davis Hammett's account of how painting a rainbow house created a ripple effect in Kansas, leading to major electoral victories. We need the artists and storytellers of all kinds more than ever.
So this is not a comprehensive list of suggestions on how you can create a more progressive America and stop entrenched corruption. There are many paths you can take, and we encourage you to think for yourself and to work together. There is no one solution. Whether you're in a blue state or a red state, these ideas apply to you. Do not take any of the freedoms you have left for granted. Never underestimate the power of hard work. Additionally, we have a reading list linked to from there because it's essential to read widely to understand how we got here and the best ways to navigate the challenges of the 21st century. So again, all of this is available on our site, gaslitnationpod.com.
Gaslit Nation is produced by Andrea Chalupa and Sarah Kenzier. If you like what we do, leave us a review on iTunes. It helps us reach more listeners. And check out our Patreon. It helps keep us going. Our editor for this was Carlin Daigle. Original music in Gaslit Nation is produced by David Whitehead, Martin Vissenberg, Nick Farr, Damian Arriaga, and Carlin Daigle. Our phenomenal logo was designed by the genius that is Hamish Smith at the New York-based design firm Order. Thank you so much, Hamish. Gaslit Nation would like to thank our supporters at the producer level on Patreon: Diana Gallagher, James Silverman, Alan Liu, Paige Harrington, David Porter, Alexandria Lane Detweiler, Kelly Ranson, Stephanie Brandt MD, Adam Levine, Glenda Guzman, Zachary Lemon, Jason Bainbridge, Jody DeWitt, John Ripley, Henri Deschamps, Kate Cotton, Lorraine W. Todd, Kevin M. Garnett, Jared Lombardo, Terry Brady, Larry Colwell, D.L. Singfield, Matt Perez, Doug Friedenberg, Nicole Spear, Ted Gary Mitchell, Carolyn Friend, Thomas Burns, Brian DeHuden, Gustav Halsby, Christy Vitale, Maureen Murphy, Michelle Dash, Jans Elstra Rasmussen, Victoria Olson, John Dambro, Jason Rita, Kevin Christie, Margaret Moe, Matthew Copeland, Rich Craw, John Keene, Luke Stranad, Catherine Anderson Karina, Kathy Kavanaugh, Lawrence Graham, Mike Tripico, Ethan Mann, Jennifer Slavic, Rhonda White, Hollis Ramsey, Kim Mellon, Ann Marshall, Irina Guardia, Eric Kaplan, Kenshiro Nakagawa, Zap Rousdower, and Sonia Bogdanovic. Thank you all so much. We could not make the show without you.